Was Jesus a Marxist? That's the question we'll be looking at today. So, we're going to start by doing a deep reading of a new book by Robert Myles and James Crossley, Jesus, a Life in Jesus, a Life in Class Conflict. So, the authors say, we seek to unpack the life of Jesus and the early Jesus movement within its original historical context of first century Palestine, but in a way relevant for all interested in the history of class conflict, irrespective of individual religious sympathies or proclivities. An orienting assumption is Jesus was not just a religious leader. And this prompts us to write not just another dry biography of a great man from the past. Rather, there are important lessons about the broader unfolding of history when the study of Jesus is properly contextualized in a life of class conflict. We offer up this historical materialist life of Jesus as part of the new quest and as a deliberate point of contrast to the perpetual proliferation of the many neoliberal lives of Jesus produced, mass marketed, and consumed over the past several decades. So, this is a central critique that they're going to continue to make, that the way that scholarship looks at Jesus is has a blind spot when it comes to class. And in looking at separating Jesus from the times that he lived in and the ideas that were prevalent at the time and the economic conditions that he lived in and the social and political environment that he lived in, you lose what the movement was originally made up of, the class orientation of the movement that Jesus was a part of and was the leader of, and also it becomes hyper focused on an individual who is the person that is proclaiming these ideas. And the ideas seem to be like these transcendent things that don't come from any material, actual circumstances in the world. So, this is like part of the ongoing critique that they're going to have. That in order to understand Jesus, you have to think about Jesus as part of the Jesus movement, a movement larger than himself, that he may have been the leader of, but that had ideas that were drawn out of the social, political, economic stuff that was lying around at the time, um, and were informed by conditions like that arose out of those social, economic, and political determining factors. Okay. The quest for the historical materialist Jesus. This is not a religious book, but a historical materialist one. It is the purpose of this book to take up two related questions regarding the life of Jesus of Nazareth. First, what can we know about the historical Jesus and his movement? Second, how can we understand the emergence of the Jesus movement in terms of class conflict as a driver of historical change? That's the thesis. Um, so it's going to be the typical historical critical process of examining the evidence and the texts and trying to go through that same type of reductionary process to get back to like this is from this era, this is from that era, but also like in doing all that, the same type of historical critical work that like a Bart Ehrman would do. We also, along with the authors, are going to take we're going to continue to keep class as a determining factor in all of our analysis. Okay. Typically, class and class conflict are overlooked or dismissed as anachronistic. In one sense, there's good reason for this, because when class and class conflict are acknowledged, they are usually associated with, or in the service of, a romanticized reconstruction of Jesus as someone who had woke views on gender and even sexuality, was a Gandhi like pacifist, a Che Guevara style revolutionary, or established a system of village communes in the countryside. So they're sort of like standing in opposition to all this kind of like anachronistic reading backwards, where we endow Jesus with our class consciousness, and our class values, and it's like the fetishized Jesus that becomes a problem with historical criticism, where your historically reconstructed Jesus tends to exhibit all of the values that the person who's the historian would like the historical Jesus to have. And this is like a recurring theme of people's like preconceived notions. Like Jesus is a very the historical Jesus, because again it takes a reductionary process to go through to try to like reconstruct who he was. Um, it's easy to be aspirational in the way that you're reading this information. And so they want to kind of stand aside from that type of anachronistic reading, where we just say, like, well, Jesus was the first woke, he was woke before it was woke, or he was really a Marxist revolutionary. So in some ways, they're already pushing back on this notion of Jesus as a Marxist. However, to challenge the anachronisms of these readings, we employ Marxist notions of class as a way of understanding how people react, consciously or not, to the contradictions inherent within the mode of production of their day. These include how Jesus and his contemporaries responded to and emerged from within the productive forces of the ancient world, as well as their entanglement within various social relations, such as those governing property, power, and prosperity, as well as gender and ethnic associations, in a rapidly changing economic landscape of first century Palestine. They're going to continue to come back to this theme of the like sort of social disintegration that was happening in Palestine, and the way that that affected the social like traditional the way that it I think they're going to continue to come back to the way that this sort of like decenters like traditional social relations, because of this like economic like the changing economic landscape. And so this will be a theme that they're going to like fully flush out and develop more. So rather, such an approach is focused on understanding the chosen subject, in this case Jesus, as a product of their social and material conditions of their time and place. So I think this is like super important. Trying to decipher what makes sense in the historical context of the Jesus movement, and it's not some sort of a later interpretation by followers like after his death, is not a later interpretation by believers after Paul has like shifted the message, like how different geographical locations where like the texts are being written by the different social economic spheres of the writers, how all of this stuff needs to be flushed out, and even intertext, like in the Gospels themselves, the normal process we have of sort of like separating things. Class should also be another filter that we sort of like try to run all this stuff through to have a better understanding of like what conceivably makes sense from the perspective of class for a Galilean movement of the peasantry during the first century. Okay. By historical materialism, we stand in the tradition of Marxist historians who explain long-term changes in human society without endlessly emphasizing their epoch-changing actions of supposedly great men. After all, great men are but the products of their society, and their individual ideas and geniuses would be impossible without the social conditions built before and during their lifetimes. It is for this reason we seek to understand Jesus as part of a broader Jesus movement. This is really like harkens back to Marx in the 18th Brunomir, where he talks about like men make history, but they make it out of not in the way of their own devising, but sort of like out of all the stuff of the past and the present that they have lying around, um, and are constrained therein. Um, so it's not that again, pushing back on this idea that like the message of Jesus comes down from heaven and is something that was totally radically new to the social political circumstances that he lived in. Is just like not a historically viable idea. It doesn't really like match the information that we have, and I think like a better interpretive lens is to think like, does this make sense within the class context of a first century Galilean peasant movement? Okay. Although Jesus emerged as a key organizer and the movement later came to bear his name, Jesus himself did not invent the movement or mastermind its ideas. Rather, what came to be known as the Jesus movement was one of many religious and social movements around the first century Palestine doing broadly similar things. Um, so we've had conversations at amongst like the staff at the podcast, the Skeptics Bible Project, that I also do, about this sort of notion of like the uniqueness of the early Jesus movement, and it's unlikely that it was very unique. There was a lot of apocalyptic movements that were going around at that time, and again, when we start to flesh out these social political circumstances and even the information that we get from the Gospels, I just think that idea of this like sort of like uniqueness is suspect. From this perspective, class antagonisms must be understood as occurring not under capitalism, but configured to the social economic relationships in a largely agrarian societies. So this, I think, is like is very important. This is an extremely important point. So a lot of the sort of like dumb discourse around this question of Jesus was a Marxist say things like that are, of course, completely true. Jesus couldn't be a Marxist. I mean, Marx didn't come around for 2,000 years after Jesus, or not quite 2,000, but 1,800 years. Yes, of course. Jesus lived pre-capitalism, and Marxism is a revolutionary fulfillment of a post-capitalist system. All of these things are true. So when we're talking about class, we're not talking about the same type of class dynamic that we would have in a capitalist system. We're talking about the type of class that you would have in an agrarian system. And this will become important when we get to some of the further ideas. And it's also important in how we read the stuff that we read back. So it was sort of like, it's easy to read anachronistically back our own ideas about class, our own ideas about like revolutionary politics into the words of Jesus, divorced from like the social, political, economic circumstances that Jesus is actually, or again, the Jesus movement exists in. And I think that creates its own problem. So part of a good Marxist reading of the Gospels and the Bible will not necessarily create some fetishized Marxist Christ. I think that those two things, I think a good historical materialist reading will flush out the social, political, economic sort of environment that this movement was able to form, find adherents, and then transform throughout a couple of early stages, and the various class dynamics at play. But agrarian society. So again, class struggle class antagonisms in an agrarian society. Accordingly, we use the terms such as peasantry to denote a broad and internally diverse category of rural workers and non elite actors closely associated with agrarian production of land and water. So again, just kind of like flushing out like peasantry. Sometimes there's objections made that peasantry, that the way that we understand it now, is sort of like influenced by like more of like a medieval idea, and that like the peasant society in Galilee like didn't necessarily correspond to like a Marxist idea of like a peasant society. All that stuff is fair. I don't want to like get into a huge debate about it or even like flush it out, but I think it's just important to note that when the authors are talking about peasantry, that they're drawing like this distinction and talking about it in a specific way to not like in a super specific legalistic way, but as sort of like a broad category: rural workers, non-elite actors, agricultural production. So that's what they mean by the peasantry. The elite sustained their relatively lavish lifestyle in varying ways through the exploitation of the labor power of the peasant masses and a system which included slave labor, land tenure, and tributary payment. So, this is the class dynamics that we're talking about. There's a elite um, in relatively lavish lifestyle, and they're able to maintain their lifestyle through exploitation of the peasant masses. How do they do that? Through a system of slave labor, land tenure, and tributary payment. Within the first century, too, a field worker, a day laborer, and a fisherman could be differentiated, but as we will see, this did not undermine possibilities for class solidarity. So there may have been like inter-class relations amongst the peasantry, and that's all fair, but I think that there was class solidarity, or the authors are making the case that there was class solidarity, even though there were like some distinctions that could be drawn amongst the peasantry. Indeed, as it will become clear elsewhere in this book, the category of peasant further helps us appreciate Jesus as more of a traditionalist than anything else. What mattered most was the preservation of traditional patterns of life with all their accompanying agrarian hierarchies in the face of a changing Galilee. So this is like a real pushback on this sort of like notion of like a Marxist Jesus. Like, again, depending on what you mean, like we'll see some stuff that sounds Marxist, and the authors like have a fun time sort of playing with anachronistic language in order to draw out like the class nature of the Jesus movement. But I think it's appropriate to show that this movement was also like extremely steeped in the agrarian mode of production that they were a part of, the like conceptions of hierarchy and power that they saw in the world around them, and that and we'll flesh this out a little bit more as well, but were limited in their scope by like those possibilities. And also, I think it's important to realize that like the earliest Jesus movement was most likely a it was a cult amongst Judaism, and one of many like millennial apocalyptic Jewish sects, and that it. So part of what the authors will flush out is that Jesus was extremely traditionally Jewish. Like the early Jesus movement was committed to keeping the law. They may have had differing interpretations on how to keep the law. They preached that you must keep the law. They preached a coming kingdom in line with other Jewish millennial beliefs at the time. So it's important to keep that context. And that came along with it a lot of like sort of traditional unwoke beliefs that we would say now, things that would like not make Jesus a comfortable person to have at a DSA meeting with you.